Okay, thank you, Doug. See if this works. Great. New Zealand King Salmon was once a very popular company. That was before we decided we wanted to grow. Back about 3 years ago, we thought the world is our oyster, excuse the pun. We've got many more customers than we've got product. We're selling that at premium prices. We've branded it all the way either to the supermarket or to the menu. So we've done all of those things, so we need to produce more to be able to supply our customers. And we put together what would be considered on the world stage a fairly modest proposal, but it hasn't gone down that way in the Marlborough Sounds. So I'll try and turn you all into salmon farmers, and I'll tell you a bit about what we do, then what our growth plans were and now what they are, the learnings we've got from that and how we would propose to go forward from here. So first about salmon farming. I think someone already mentioned it this morning. Aquaculture now equals all of the world's wild catch combined. So that literally means if we didn't have aquaculture, we would need 2 planets. And I don't think people realise the incredible contribution that aquaculture now makes. It is one of the most environmentally sustainable ways of farming animal protein, whether that be mussels and oysters or salmon. For example, mussels and oysters, they remove nitrogen from the environment and they take up a fair bit of space. Salmon contributes nitrogen to the environment, but it takes up very little space. But all round, if you compare those to other forms of agriculture, they do very well. And that goes back, in terms of fish are just incredibly efficient. They don't need to fight gravity, and they're cold-blooded. As a result of that, they've just got incredible growth rates, and they put on lots of weight. I've been on Norwegian salmon farms where they've fed 50 tonnes of feed on that day, and those fish have put on 50 tonnes of weight on that day. That's the efficiency you can achieve with salmon farming. That's because you can achieve an FCR of 1. So if you put in 1 kilo of feed, you can get 1 kilo of salmon out, which is incredible. Unfortunately, we're not quite as efficient as that in New Zealand, but we're working on it, and sheep and cattle would have an FCR more like 10 to 1. The industry in New Zealand is increasingly recognised for its green credentials. Most of the industry now, or much of it, is certified by Global Aquaculture Alliance with their Best Aquaculture Practice program. Right, that is what is under our salmon farms before we start salmon farming. That's the soft sediments of the Marlborough Sounds. One of the criticisms that we get is that we don't treat our waste, and salmon produce feces, and they drop to the bottom of the seafloor. That is the downside of salmon farming. It falls onto that surface that you see there, and their microorganisms and worms will break it down. Sometimes I get people saying to me, you should vacuum all of that up, you should take it to the Picton sewage works, you should put it through there, and then I say, well, exactly the same thing would happen. Microorganisms would break it down, and then it would be released into Picton Harbour. We would waste a whole lot of energy, and the very process that's going on in a sewage works, turning it into a harmless byproduct, happens benignly under our farms every day. Our feed meets the World Wildlife Fund guidelines, so even with an FCR of 1 to 1, if we took all of the world's wild catch and fed it to all the world's aquaculture, we'd be no further ahead. We'd have exactly the same amount of fish. So it's very important that aquaculture has learnt to substitute marine protein, and we've done that by substituting vegetable protein and land-based animal protein. And humans eat offal, and we convert the remains that people don't use in terms of human production into protein powder that then goes into our feed for our salmon. We supplement that with about 8% of our protein now comes from the wild fisheries, and just like the New Zealand wild fishery is a well-managed fishery, so too is the Peruvian and Chilean anchovy fishery, and that's where our 8% comes from. So as a result of that, we're net producers of marine protein. So we actually produce more marine protein, more marine oil than we consume in our feeds. Fully stocked, a salmon farm is 2% fish and 98% water space. So this salmon are a schooling creature, they want to be together, but because we've got volume and not just surface area, there's still quite a bit of space on our farms, in fact 98% space. Salmon is in fact the largest single source of omega-3s in the New Zealand diet. I might come under some pressure with all these seafood people here, but by my calculations, salmon is about 40% of the seafood sold through supermarkets. It's the only oily fish of any note. It's got a very high omega-3 level, so that means it's making the biggest contribution. Not sure if the room's fully aware, but the beneficial omega-3s that are sought after for health reasons are only from marine origin. The short-chain omega-3s of plant origin do not have the same health benefits. So every cell in your body needs omega-3s, long-chain omega-3s, and they can only come from the marine environment. And they're important for cardiovascular health, eye health, brain development, and joints. We're quite unique in New Zealand in that we farm a species that others don't farm. So around the world they farm Atlantic salmon and trout, and here we farm a different species, king salmon. They're very difficult to grow. They tried to grow them down the west coast of America many years ago, basically gave up on that. You need a lot of intellectual property to grow this species and to do it in a premium way, and New Zealand has that. So here we have a fairly, a unique position, adding value. We're able to get premium prices, and nobody else is doing it. There's really only one farm farming this species outside of New Zealand. That is what a salmon farm looks like. So I think it's rather beautiful. In the background, there's actually another salmon farm. I don't know if you can notice it. So that's our Clay Point farm in the foreground and Tupungu in the background. And just again to talk about the efficiency of salmon farming, those two salmon farms can produce all of New Zealand's salmon requirements. So that 40% that's sold through supermarkets that I mentioned, these two farms can produce the whole lot, and for food service as well besides. So they're about 1 surface hectare each, and they're on about 10 to 20 surface hectares for the moorings. All right, I do want to acknowledge we do have an impact. Those feces go to the bottom. They're broken down by microorganisms and worms. In fact, a huge abundance of worms moves in. They're the worms that naturally exist in the Marlborough Sounds for breaking down organic matter. But in our 25 years of history, we've never had any remote environmental problem. So if I contrast that to what happens regularly in Picton, so it's not unusual when I go there, I'll see the beach is closed. And it's certainly not closed due to aquaculture, it's closed because people's septic tanks have overflowed. It's gone into the harbour, and as a result of that, the beach is closed. So certainly no enduring or any problems from salmon farming or mussel farming, but the human impact can be quite severe, especially in the inner areas close to Picton. Another great thing about salmon farming is a site will fully remediate within 2 to 10 years. So it's not, certainly in the land situation, it's fairly unusual that you can get your original pristine environment back within a couple of years' time, and you can with salmon farming. So although we have a low or small impact, we can't be held to a no impact standard, and often that is the standard that's held out for us. So we're always looking for ways to improve and to reduce our impact, but when we're compared to zero, that's a very tough target to achieve. And our single company supplies about half of the world's production. All right, that's an aerial picture of the Marlborough Sounds, the beautiful environment in which we operate. That's our Ruakaka farm. The new farms, assuming they go ahead, will be in much more sympathetic colours than that one. Those white patches are where the nets have been lifted and they're drying in the sun. In the future, we'll have black nets, for example. That's a mussel farm, an equally important industry in the Marlborough Sounds. You can see it has a much lower profile, but it uses a lot more surface area. So this map makes that point. So all of those little black dots, they're all mussel farms, and there's, in this sound, this is the Pelora Sound, there's one salmon farm up towards the outer entrance there. So my point is, salmon requires a very small amount of space. but it does discharge nitrogen. Mussel farms draw in nitrogen, but they require more space to operate. Right, another great thing about salmon farming. So this is the per surface hectare return of primary agriculture and aquaculture. So per surface hectare, sheep and cattle generate about $700, $700 to $800, and you can see salmon generates $1.4 million. But it's slightly better than that, actually. I mentioned before that most of a salmon farm is mooring lines, and those mooring lines are actually public space. People can go fishing in them, people can go boating in them. If you only count the surface hectares, this is what the chart looks like. So per surface hectare, generating $20 million worth of revenue. If you compare that to any other industry, they don't show up. All right, so what did we have and what were we aspiring to? So we have 5 farms now, so it's approximately 5 surface hectares in production at any time. We were asking for 9 new farms, making up 12 surface hectares. So there was our first big mistake. Never should have said 9 farms. Should have said 1 farm with 9 1-hectare paddocks. I think when you say 9 farms, people think of thousands of hectares rather than, well, 12. And it is important the way that you communicate, and that was a mistake. If we say 9 farms, people think of maybe tens of thousands of hectares. There are 150,000 surface hectares in the Marlborough Sounds, of which 2,800 are in operation for mussels. We currently generate about $110 million worth of revenue. We think we could have gone to between $400 and $500 million worth of revenue with our plans, and our exports would have grown to about 300 of that. That would have added about 370 jobs to the 450 we've already got. All right, so the result so far we don't have anything. We've been awarded 4 farms, but then they were appealed to the High Court, and now they're being appealed to the Supreme Court. That'll be heard in terms of will it go to the court? That'll be heard on the 16th of October. All right, a bit more of the background there. So unfortunately, over the last 20 years, not one surface hectare has been made available for salmon farming in the Marlborough Sounds. So the 2 that we've got, the only 2 good surface hectares we've got, were sort of accidents. One was like a research area, and the other one was set aside for mussels, but you can't grow mussels there. So it has the conditions that suited us, and they're often the exact opposite of what you want for a mussel farm. And so our whole 450 people depend on these 2 surface hectares. So in our view, they're sort of dangling a bit by a thread when we're constrained to such a small amount of space. As I mentioned, we generate $20 million per surface hectare, and we have a payroll of $4.5 million per surface hectare. So in terms of, does New Zealand get a good deal out of this? Is there a lot of employment that flows per surface hectare? Well, we pay out $4.5 million of wages for every surface hectare we have. And we could have had 370 new jobs. All right, now one of the things advanced is that we're moving to a more evidenced or science-based decision-making process. And I would say that's partly true, but it's not completely true. All the evidence does, and in the end we had 10,000 pages of evidence, it gets you a seat at the table, because really the RMA is always going to be a big compromise. So if you have the best science in the world and some of those things that I've mentioned there, and you've got 10,000 pages in total, then that's pitted up against all the other interests and all the other emotion that goes with that. And then it comes down to, is the science going to prevail or is the emotion going to prevail? And I'm not saying those other views aren't valid, but we thought it was more going to be, science versus science, and it's not. The reality is it's science versus, people's emotions. It cost us $10 million to go this far, which is a lot of money, and it really does, it has damaged our corporate reputation. And if you ever go through the process, people can give evidence, but they can also just make a submission. If you make a submission, you don't have to swear yourself in, you make your statements, and then you go off. If you make a submission, you won't be paid as much attention to than if you've given evidence. But the papers report exactly the same as if you had given evidence. So someone came in and said, King Salmon never paid me proper holiday pay. While I worked for them, they poisoned me, accidentally. And then we checked our employment records and they'd never worked for us ever. But that didn't make any difference. That still made it into the papers the next day. So unfortunately, there's an asymmetry around this where the negative comes out, it'll go into the papers, and there's no recourse against that. And it does lead to a huge loss of focus on the business. So, we want to be doing what we do best, and that's taking a premium branded food delicacy to the world. And this battle, this pitched battle that goes on within our own backyard is just a huge drain on our resources. All right, so unfortunately there were numerous protests, and I remember one which was organised by Guardians of the Sounds, and it was a boat flotilla, and it was pitched as there will be 200 boats out on the water, and that got the TV stations down as a result of that. They rang me up and said, there's going to be 200 boats out there. I said, I'll be amazed if there's 100 boats out there, to which the reporter swore over the phone, but still decided to come down. Well, in the end, there were 35 boats, of which 5 were for media, so there were 30 boats. But it never got reported that the supposed flotilla of 200 boats was reduced down to 30 active boats, because that didn't make good didn't make good news coverage that night. And now I just want to show you now, just shortly, a video that appeared on Campbell Live. And I just want to see if you can spot the difference here. So this is a young lady, talking to Campbell Live about her experiences in the Marlborough Sounds, and they actually got a kitchen sink and they put it down in one spot and they draw up the sediment, and then they take it to another spot and they draw up the sediment. And just see if the newspaper reporter or the reporter picks up on the difference, because I don't know, well, see what you think. I don't think there's anything different about the two samples. So if we can just play that.
She wanted you to see it too. So with 15-year-old Liam at the helm, we headed to Wahina Bay, where before last week, King Salmon had one of its farms.
When you look at the surface of the water, it looks quite clean. And you don't notice what's actually underneath. And a lot of people don't know, so they're not too bothered about it either way. But if you know what it looks like underneath, you'll have a different impression of these farms in general.
Fiona and Liam have used the best of the resources they have to get a sample from the seafloor.
It's a dredge, but it's supposed to be a sink. So this is an old sink.
A laundry sink, is it?
Yeah, it is, actually. Yeah. And you weigh it down, the lip here digs into the seabed, and then it just gets captured in here.
So a sample collects in there.
Yep.
So it's simple and effective?
It is.
Turns out they aren't the only ones interested in this site.
Oh, they got a call from a scientist, so they're testing as well. Probably a bit more scientifically, but they've got a boat made for it, you see. But we're not sure when those results will come out, or at least be public anyway.
When Campbell Live spoke to King Salmon before the hearing began, it admitted its farms do have an effect on the seafloor, but it says its practice is sustainable and won't leave lasting effects. Leona wants to make sure that's true.
So the farm is right across here.
Yeah, those boys mark where the moorings are. Keep letting it out.
While we wait, it's worth asking, by making King Salmon jump through hoops, are we biting the hand that feeds us? The company claims the new farms would bring in another $100 million a year in exports, which goes a long way towards the government's plan for a $1 billion aquaculture industry by 2025.
The biggest concern is if King Salmon get their way, they're just paving a new road. And once the prohibited zones are kind of, well, like if King Salmon get past that, and they can just go wherever the hell they want, then why shouldn't other companies do the same?
Empty that. The same sort of stuff. You can see that at the top, it looks a little bit brown, but when you get in there, it's really dark. You can't imagine much living in there. There's one of those worms.
So you think this sludge is a direct result of the farm being here?
Yep.
Yeah, you can
Smell that.
It smells a bit rotten.
Yeah, well, that's what it is.
Here we are.
In comparison, here's some footage Leona and Liam shot of a proposed site in Taupipi, still untouched by commerce.
Texture's good. Got some life in there. Got shells.
It's not a foolproof study by any means, but Leona has taken her samples to the Environment Court, just doing her bit, she says.
But I'm not a scientist or anything, but this is just what I think is, to me, nothing can really survive in this sort of thing.
All right, I think that's enough on that. So, when you look at those two samples, there's not a lot of difference between them. And the reporter could have said, look, the emperor's got no clothes here. But she didn't, and she just went on, and then we had no right of reply to that, which was disappointing. The young man there talked about the prohibited zone. Unfortunately, when Marlborough the Sounds was zoned, we didn't know the conditions that were necessary for salmon. So we need, deep, cold, fast-flowing currents, which was not a requirement. So therefore, there's no space in the aquaculture prohibited zone for us to farm in, unfortunately. All right, another thing that has really surprised me is about king salmon's profitability. I'll be going toe-to-toe with these environmentalist groups, proving to me that my company's not profitable, which I say, well, we've just funded $10 million worth of expansion plans. We're paying 350 or 450 people's salaries every week, but they just mount an incredibly persuasive argument about why our company's not profitable, which I'm astounded someone would have the temerity to do that. All right, and so one of the things is, King Salmon's advice was always, try and go under the radar, keep quiet about things. There's no point responding to every single submitter's claim, which we didn't. Okay, that seems to have stopped there. Oh, here we go. The board has unlimited power to ask for more resources and to request more reports, and that just takes the cost up and up. Central government are overall supportive, but during our application, and maybe that's changed now, they certainly weren't coordinated. So we had MPI, very supportive, very constructive at the hearing, but then you've got DOC, on the other hand, opposing most of the sites. This has led to just delay after delay, and we've made commitments to customers. We want to be building these farms, and it's just being stretched out longer and longer, unfortunately. We do have the possibility of still getting nothing, which is, would be a travesty for us. And whilst we've been going on this process, Tasmania has achieved 5 times the amount of space at 1/5 the cost. So a big expansion in Macquarie Harbour at a cost of about $1.3 million. All right, just looking at the scale of the industry. So Norway produces 1 million tonnes of salmon. They're the world's leading producer. Chile, 450,000, Australia, 55,000, the Faroe Islands, 43,000, and we produce 13,000 tonnes, of which most of it, well, a bit over half is exported. We wanted to take it to 30,000 tonnes. As you can see, in the scheme of things, this is actually not a big production. And I'll just compare the Faroe Islands, that produces 40,000 tonnes, with the Banks Peninsula, that produces 240 tonnes. They're approximately the same size area. That's about 40 kilometres across there. So it just shows that, in terms of what's possible and the mindset that we're sometimes bound with. All right, so an alternative, and I'll wind up on the next 2 slides. It's really for central government to decide, is salmon farming a valuable industry or is it not? And then really to undertake the research to identify the space that we need to operate in. And they should really work with the regional councils, because that's where it all tends to break down, is at that regional level, and local communities, identify the affected parties, mitigate the effects, deal with compensation, and the not in my backyard syndrome. And then really to tender the space, with a valid resource consent, with long-term tenure, and hopefully if we can get away from this concept that we're in public space, which is in fact the legal situation is we are in public space. But the problem that brings is everyone thinks they've got a right to it, or that you don't have any property rights at all when you use that term public space. Right, so if I use the sporting analogy, and we look at Team New Zealand has to be heading in the same direction. We've got a number of disadvantages out there. Our distance from market is a problem. We need a supportive Team New Zealand to go out there and to be successful in international markets. And it's any coach or any leader's responsibility to make sure the whole team is heading in the same direction. And so in terms of managing some of these things, I think it is very hard for a single company to be able to do that. And central government does have a role in explaining the importance of industry, economics, export income to the New Zealand population, and then which industries are we proud of and do we want to support, and then try and get a momentum behind that. Certainly, we can't take on, environmental group number 1, number 2, number 3, which has been the situation over the last 2 or 3 years. Final comments, wealthy countries can afford to look after their environments. And I think third world countries can't afford to do that. And if you look at the environments of Tasmania, Scotland and Norway, all big salmon producers, they have fantastic environments, and those farms blend in very well there. And wealthy countries, they're more in control of their population. When people become affluent, they naturally reduce their population growth. So it's really important that New Zealand remains and continues to grow in its wealth so that we can protect our environment and so that we've got options for the future. Thank you.